Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
Hello, welcome to a new MENA Talks. I'm Jasmin Arémi. I'm a MENA Watch editor, and today's guest is Rebecca Schönenbach. Today we'll be discussing the Iranian uprising, European security, and the responsibility of the West. Ms. Schönenbach, you are widely recognized as an expert in counterterrorism, specializing in Islamist structures and their financial networks. Additionally, you hold the esteemed position of chairwoman for Women for Freedom. How would you briefly describe your work concerning Iran and the Islamic Republic in just a sentence or two?
Well, with Women for Freedom, we have been collaborating for many years now alongside Iranian dissidents, among them Mina Ahadi, but also, and most importantly, with the daughters of Germans held captive in Iran at the time, Jamshid Sharmad and Nahid Tagavi, specifically Mariam Claren, Nahid Tagavi's daughter, and Ghazal Sharmad, Jamshid Sharmad's daughter, to generate public awareness not only for their specific cases but for the overall issue of hostage policy. And, naturally, also about how women are systematically suppressed in Iran. Iran is a complete gender apartheid state. Legally, compulsory veiling is strictly mandated. By law, women are legally obligated to have a male guardian. For over 40 years, no woman has been permitted to sing on television. Women are banned from sports events, etc. It's full gender apartheid. And for years, we've collaborated with Iranians who have highlighted this issue, aiming to increase pressure on the German government to finally take measures against this gender apartheid. My apologies. That is my voluntary commitment as a women's rights activist, and, well, the other side of things, naturally, is that I specialize in the fight against terrorism financing, specifically bringing attention to the way the regime in Iran has exerted its influence within Europe. And most people tend to overlook that the regime has indeed perpetrated attacks right here, particularly in recent years, not merely back in the 80s. And of course, it has funded diverse terrorist endeavors, alongside extremist actions that, while operating within legal bounds, are nevertheless directed at dismantling democracy and the principles of the rule of law. And that's what I've mostly dealt with professionally, that is, when it came to Iran. Of course, there are other topics in this field.
Indeed, the protests in Iran have truly never fully subsided since the uprising following Gina Mahsa Amini's death over 3 years ago. They keep flaring up, and then naturally we again experienced a significant protest, a substantial uprising that was brutally suppressed. There's massive repression. How do you currently view the situation in the country right now? Structurally speaking, would you still describe them as protests, or would you already call it a creeping revolutionary process?
I would definitely characterize it as a revolutionary process, one that truly began with the Woman Life Freedom Revolution, making a significant impact. The present protests have indeed been reignited due to economic factors. These particular protests originated from the bazaris, those who maintain the bazaars, in Tehran, and who are actually considered regime loyalists. But the protests were then joined again, mainly by young people in Iran who simply want to live a different life. And it's a revolution because, for example, the clearest sign that the population is not on the side of its government, on the side of the regime, is that since the Woman Life Freedom movement, women in Iran hardly wear the headscarf anymore. Even though it is legally mandated, so many women no longer wear the headscarf that the police simply cannot enforce it. And that is a clear sign that the population is already living a different life than the one that is actually prescribed for them. Furthermore, the compulsory gender segregation is also no longer being widely enforced. And it's actually been clear for many years now, especially since 2019, which itself was another significant revolution that the regime is bound to collapse at some point in the future. It's simply a matter of time, and that is mainly due to the demographic structure in Iran. People under 30 make up 60% of the population. And there's tremendous pressure also because people now see through the internet that a different kind of life exists in the West, and they earnestly wish to experience that life themselves. And because of these young people who have no economic opportunities and want to live a different life, the pressure on the regime is growing.
The images and developments of recent months have somehow made it especially evident that this uprising impacts us here in Europe. Could you perhaps briefly explain the reasons behind this?
First off, the uprising most certainly impacts Europe, given that the regime stands as one of the world's most significant financiers of terror. In the Middle East, this is very clear. They have financed Hamas, they have financed Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they have partially financed Hezbollah, and they support the Houthis, including with arms shipments. This means there will be no peace in the Middle East as long as the regime is in power. This doesn't just affect Israel, it affects the entire region. Iraq is practically occupied by Iranian militias. There was intervention in Syria. Of course, Assad was a proxy for the regime, but even currently the regime persistently strives to maintain its authority in Syria and is also heavily engaged with spreading disinformation. This means it affects us through refugee flows. By the way, the regime always uses this to threaten European governments. So each time, for example, a ban on the Revolutionary Guards was discussed, the regime would declare, by the way, we currently have 1 to 2 million Afghans in our country, and we could also ship them off to Europe. That served as their primary threat. However, it's undeniable that all the turmoil and conflicts in the region are directly linked to the regime, which in turn fuels the refugee crises, particularly with Syrians arriving in Europe since 2015. This constitutes one significant consequence. And the other effect, naturally, is that the regime directly finances and commissions acts of terrorism right here in our countries, often through channels like organized crime. And the other really important thing is to have a fundamental understanding. If we truly want to protect our domestic security, we absolutely must be clear about who our allies truly are. And we see that the regime in Iran, that the population in Iran, is overwhelmingly pro-Western. Surveys from GAMAAN, a Dutch think tank, for example, after the June 2025 12-day war, questioned the Iranian populace as best they could, who they believed was responsible for starting the war and whose side they were on. And the Iranian populace unequivocally identified their own government as the war's instigator, aligning themselves with Israel and consequently with democracy and the rule of law. This means that within the general population we have partners whom we can actively support. Should they truly succeed in overthrowing the current regime and ascending to power, they would not only foster greater peace and stability throughout the entire region, but they would also significantly enhance our security at home. This is because fundamentally these individuals have no intention of plotting attacks within Europe.
Before we delve into the EU's ban on the Revolutionary Guards, let's briefly touch upon some internal matters concerning Iran and its regime. Which population groups are most vulnerable to the regime? Most vulnerable to the regime? I assume it's women. And to what extent does this continuous disempowerment serve as a central pillar for the regime's power and its ongoing hold on power?
Basically, all women in Iran are at risk. Every woman who doesn't want to bow to the Islamist rules that the regime has dictated. Any woman in Iran who advocates for women's rights is charged as a terrorist and typically found guilty under a statute that translates to something akin to enmity against God, which is essentially blasphemy. And blasphemy carries the death penalty. But it particularly affects women from minority groups, even more so. Gina Mahsa Amini herself was an Iranian Kurd, and last year Iran executed a record number of protesters who were part of the Woman Life Freedom Movement, carrying out these state-sanctioned executions. Among those executed, a disproportionate number were Kurds. And it is hitting the persecuted especially hard again now. The regime is acting with extreme cruelty, especially in the Kurdish areas. This also applies to other minorities. It's important to understand that half of Iran's population is Persian, and the other half consists of minorities Kurds, Balochs, Armenians, and even religious minorities like the Baha'i, who are severely persecuted. The women of the Baha'i faith are also very heavily affected by these repressive measures. They crack down especially hard in these areas, particularly on women.
This pervasive presence of such violence, what function does this serve for maintaining power? Is it truly something that can keep people oppressed and subdued? Has that simply proven effective? There are no sanctions against it? Unfortunately, not at all.
Indeed, it has proven effective. The regime has systematically used certain forms of violence, particularly sexualized violence, for over 40 years, not only against its own populace, but also as an export. A prime example is under Assad, in his torture prisons, which were considered among the most gruesome torture prisons worldwide. We also witnessed these horrifying torture methods on October 7th during the Hamas massacre, in which the regime was deeply involved. The regime planned this massacre for over 2 years, and the sexual violence on October 7th was systematic. This was planned, publicly executed, and carried out in different locations. And in that, a pattern emerged that we are already familiar with from Iran. For example, in the Woman Life Freedom Movement, women were shot with buckshot directly in the face and genitals. So there was a specific pattern that underground doctors in Iran described. The Guardian reported that men mostly sustained gunshot wounds to their backs, whereas women were encircled, then had their faces mutilated and were shot in the genital region specifically to amplify the horror and fear, intensifying the terror experienced and maximizing the brutality. And naturally, women were abducted from the streets and then subjected to rape within the torture facilities of the regime's operatives. In some horrific instances, after these rapes, the women were brutally murdered and their bodies were deliberately left in such a manner that their families would undeniably recognize the atrocities inflicted upon these young women. And this kind of systematic sexual violence against the population, of course, spreads lasting terror and also destroys cohesion. It's meant to traumatize their relatives, to fill all women with fear and horror, and naturally it's also intended to damage social cohesion, which was also the case with the Hamas massacre. One goal was to ensure that all Jewish women would then be traumatized, which indeed had a worldwide effect through the secondary traumatization of Jewish women. And the regime has truly perfected this particular brand of cruelty. This, of course, does not only affect women. Men are also killed and incidentally raped. But the systematic nature of this very clearly indicates that they also specifically target the disfigurement of women. So beauty is meant to be eradicated. The celebration of femininity is intended for destruction, and this indeed has tangible effects. And the atrocities that we've witnessed recently. First off, the sheer scale of the murders was truly unprecedented. I mean, there were already mass executions happening back in the 80s. In every prior protest wave, about 1,000 people were killed, but this time it's at least 6,000 confirmed fatalities, 6,000 individual stories that have been identified as confirmed murders of protesters. Some estimates even put the death toll at 30,000, with hundreds of thousands more injured. It's a scale that is truly, I believe, is scarcely imaginable. Every Iranian man and woman I'm currently speaking with on the phone who still has family in Iran is deeply affected. There is no one who is not affected. There isn't a family that doesn't know someone who has died or been murdered. And then there are the stories that this time it wasn't just shootings, which happened in past protests, and not just kidnappings, which also happened in past protests, but they also sent members of the various militias dressed in plain clothes into the protests. They attacked from behind with knives, clubbing young women to death, striking them down mercilessly. They didn't just hurt them, they deliberately ended their lives with extreme cruelty. Truly the barbaric way one would cruelly slaughter animals. And these stories alone have spread, causing the entire country to currently be in a state of shock and paralysis. There's also a curfew in effect. So, people aren't allowed out at specific times, and if they do venture out, for instance, to go grocery shopping, they must live in fear of being murdered on their way to the store. So it's an unimaginable cruelty, one that has profoundly shocked and astonished the Iranian people themselves. This level of brutality has never been witnessed before, and the populace will not easily forget or forgive the regime for its atrocious actions. Therefore, this cannot be forgiven. It is an outright massacre of its own people, which will undoubtedly have significant and lasting repercussions.
Furthermore, what else are Iranian exiles reporting when you engage in conversations with them regarding the events that have unfolded over the past few weeks?
Well, most of them naturally report that when the then US President Donald Trump made his statement, they keep protesting, help is on the way. They truly believed assistance would actually materialize. Now they are gripped by immense disappointment and a profound sense of irresponsibility for urging young people to protest, effectively sending them to their deaths. I believe that, alongside the sheer scale of the murders and the unimaginable violence, this constitutes the most profound shock currently striking the hearts of the Iranian people. So this perception that what is happening is an absolute betrayal, first by saying we will help you, and then doing nothing at all. Although it is still possible that something might yet come to pass, but the feeling of betrayal is immense. However, these murders have already occurred and unfortunately cannot be reversed. So to say in that moment we're on our way makes everyone naturally assume that aid is truly and immediately at hand. But that simply didn't happen, and that is. This is likely the most significant shock that Iranians are currently reporting, and it is above all a continuous betrayal. The European governments have refused for a very long time to actually take effective action against the regime. The discussion about banning the Revolutionary Guards has been going on for years. Again and again, European democratic governments have refused to take any meaningful action concerning this matter. Sanctions were imposed with great hesitation, and for the most part, actions spoke much louder through their absence, leaving only unfulfilled promises. And the fact that a US president actually said, "We will help you," and then didn't follow through, is now seen as the maximum disappointment. And above all, it's being said that he bears partial responsibility for these murders because it was clear the regime would act cruelly against the demonstrators. But the reason so many people dared to demonstrate was because of that promise.
German policy has always regarded Iran as a significant and consistently reliable trading partner. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, for example. Frank-Walter Steinmeier also always stated quite clearly that Germany was a partner to Iran. But if we look closely now, the Islamic Republic isn't merely a threat to its own populace, but also poses a significant danger to Europe and Israel. What exactly does this threat entail in concrete terms?
Well, first of all, this point about being a trading partner was always a bit ridiculous because the trade volume, oil, was sanctioned. So it's been years since we've purchased any oil from Iran. The trade volume is extremely low, not from an Iranian perspective, where it was already a decisive factor, but certainly from a German perspective. Medical supplies, which are still permitted to be delivered even under sanctions due to humanitarian exceptions, clearly represent one part of this, especially for medical needs, but the rest. In terms of trade volume, it's essentially nuts, carpets, and other commodities. And the trade volume for Germany is so negligible that it's completely insignificant and not at all a determining factor. So saying it's an important trading partner was always just an excuse. It's simply nonsense. The threat, as I see it, is composed of various intricate aspects. Iran has really perfected a unique form of hybrid warfare, which on the one hand involves both military and terrorist activities, essentially a strategy reliant on violence. The nation of Iran has 600,000 men under arms, 200,000 in the Revolutionary Guards, 400,000 in other units. It is the biggest military power in the Middle East. That's more soldiers than Egypt, which boasts the second largest armed force. It's currently considerably larger, far more substantial than the Saudi army. This means that it is a factor, and thus Iran's military threats are indeed effective. Terrorist activities, as I've already outlined, encompass the unwavering support provided to various terrorist organizations. So, on the one hand, there's Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Houthis, but also the PFLP, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. While it no longer plays a military role in the Middle East, it plays a decisive role in propaganda, especially at our universities. And that's the second aspect. So, one aspect is military might, terrorist influence, and amidst all of this there are the cyber attacks that the regime also carries out as well. For example, you might be familiar with the case of the Dutch bakery, which gained widespread attention. It's an actual bakery in the Netherlands whose identity was hijacked by a Revolutionary Guard cyber unit, using it to spy on dissidents. There's also a company in Germany known as Softcloud, which is connected to a Revolutionary Guards company, responsible for both internet shutdowns and cyber activities, for example. Thus, cyber attacks are one of the regime's instruments, and the third aspect, of course, is propaganda and influencing public opinion. Specifically, it's about influencing public opinion in such a way that democracy and the rule of law are significantly destabilized. For example, in June of 25, during the 12-day war, we witnessed something significant. When the internet shutdown commenced in Iran, as the regime began throttling internet access accounts on X in Scotland that were actively campaigning for Scottish independence mysteriously vanished without a trace. So this means direct election interference, as a matter of fact. This is one of the most well-known phenomena, that the regime relies heavily on bot armies, but also on other methods of influence to spread its message. They operate various channels, such as Press TV and others, which, it must be said, haven't achieved significant success within Germany. However, there are indeed Iranian news channels, for instance in South America, which rank among the top 3 most clicked daily news sources. They broadcast regular local news, but also Iranian propaganda. They use PFLP front organizations. This includes organizations like Samidun, which are currently banned in our country, but also groups such as Mahsa Badil, who receive substantial backing from Iran. Their purpose is to sway public opinion here, not only concerning Israel, but also regarding our legal and constitutional processes. And this strategy proves to be exceedingly successful within left-leaning to far-left factions, as well as in academic circles. And then, pertaining to the realm of terrorism I just brought up, there's the involvement and significant overlap with organized criminal activities. On the one hand, they engage in drug trafficking to finance groups such as Hezbollah, for instance, but also to carry out contract killings. Sometimes successfully. For instance, in the Netherlands, Iranian dissidents were murdered by a gang connected to the Kinahan clan. That's an Irish criminal clan that's closely associated with and working for Hezbollah. And in Sweden, various gangs, mostly of Arab origin, were contracted to carry out these acts. Fortunately, most of their attempts were stopped. But such activities are developing and also expanding. In the past, the regime predominantly relied on agents who covertly operated as diplomats to execute their attacks. However, these days they are more inclined to rely on organized crime networks to execute their attacks. And Matthew Levitt, recognized as one of the most prominent terror analysts in the US, has scrutinized the foiled and successful attacks perpetrated by the Iranian regime in Europe over the past several years. There have been over 150% of these incidents, amounting to approximately 50 attacks, committed since the year 2021. So this is escalating. The number of attacks by the regime in Europe is also increasing quite dramatically.
Now, you don't get the feeling that much is happening from a political standpoint. However, the Revolutionary Guards have now, at the EU level, been officially classified and designated as a terrorist organization. Does that have a significant tangible impact on European security and on the Revolutionary Guards themselves, specifically on their financing system?
Yes, that definitely has an impact. The sanctioning took place at EU level. In the EU, it's the case that UN sanctions are automatically adopted by the EU, and the EU can issue its own sanctions. And then, the implementation of those sanctions will subsequently be carried out at the national level. Well, the listing as a terrorist organization occurs at the EU level, and then the implementation of these sanctions takes place nationally. And it is the case that in the EU, the foreign ministers are required to vote unanimously in favor of imposing a sanction. That's why it took so long, because there were always countries that blocked it. Among others, this includes Germany, by the way. The ramifications of being listed as a terrorist organization primarily signify that financial flows can indeed be frozen. Therefore, for instance, companies such as SoftCloud, which collaborate with affiliates of the Revolutionary Guards, could face significant difficulties, or rather, these financial transactions will then be sanctioned, and all associated payments will be promptly frozen. Iran was actually already severed from the official financial system, but naturally it still had numerous companies operating abroad, acting as its proxies and agents. And these companies are then curtailed or actually sanctioned, which means they can no longer operate effectively. The members of the Revolutionary Guard, specifically the members themselves, are now barred from entering the country. It also impacts the relatives of direct Revolutionary Guards members. Similar to Russian oligarchs, their children, for example, can also be subjected to an entry ban, which indeed has significant consequences and real-world implications. Well, almost all the children of high-ranking Revolutionary Guards are actually studying in Western countries. So it hits them personally, and that, of course, has an effect. It truly has an economic impact within Iran, because by now, as much as 80% of the Iranian economy finds itself under the direct control of the Revolutionary Guards. This means that they also transfer their money abroad. They don't keep it within Iran, so their personal assets can be frozen, and they are then located. In Europe too, an article recently covered a Revolutionary Guard financier and his asset management in London, Frankfurt, etc. Here in Germany, we still have as many as 4 banks that are intricately linked with the regime. Bank SEPA is one such bank tied to the Revolutionary Guards. It could also be hit. And so, it has another effect, and I believe this is massively underestimated. Specifically, it curbs the regime's radicalization efforts. After Qasem Soleimani, the former leader of the Revolutionary Guards, was eliminated, memorial events were held in his honor. Then, precisely 1 year after his passing, further commemorative ceremonies were held to mark the anniversary. And these events, for example, are also prevented because, of course, you're not allowed to display the symbols, nor are you allowed to venerate the leaders and so on. And it is often assumed that the Shiite institutions, especially the religious Shiite institutions connected to the regime, have hardly any impact outside of Shiite circles here. But that is actually quite incorrect. In fact, for many years now, the Belgian police have been confirming that conversions of Sunni youth to Shi'ism are indeed occurring. In Belgium, it was assumed a few years ago that it was about 2,000 per year, which sounds like a small number, but when you know how high the barrier is to switch from Sunnism to Shi'ism, it's significant. And a BKA rep recently confirmed to me that this is true in Germany too. This implies they genuinely exert a radicalizing influence even within Muslim communities that aren't their original or customary milieus. This shouldn't be underestimated, especially regarding the violence potential if they're radicalized in those institutions. There are still institutions like the Al-Mustafa Institute. It offers Islamic courses, and they also have connections to the Revolutionary Guards. And all these activities could at least be restricted, and they would also have to officially distance themselves from the curriculum, which would essentially shut them down. So it really has a truly resounding impact when you designate the Revolutionary Guards, and you can clearly see that with Hamas, for instance. It's quite evident. Of course, Hamas cells will continue to exist, as will those of the Revolutionary Guards, but you just can't run a Hamas office in Germany. And that's essentially the situation we find ourselves in right now. We currently have numerous offices, mosques, and other entities that serve as representatives of the Iranian regime, and they continue to operate with official authorization in our country. This ban, however, should significantly curb their activities.
Would you also say that this ban is already a good first step, but that potentially even more needs to happen now, after this massacre of the civilian population?
Well, it's a very significant step. We've been advocating for this for years and, frankly, have consistently hit a brick wall. It's a very clear, indeed, and unmistakable signal to the regime, indicating that Europe no longer aligns with or lends its support to this particular policy. Well, it is a good first step indeed. It's the first significant indication that with the old politics, following the snapback mechanism, which was actually initiated by the current government, the second signal that this policy of change through trade, meaning rapprochement with Iran, is genuinely no longer considered a political priority, as it has indeed been the top priority in recent years, specifically since 2015. That has been clearly broken with, but much, much more could be done. Individual regime members are already sanctioned. This scope could be vastly broadened to encompass various other members beyond just the Revolutionary Guards. This includes, for instance, high-ranking members of the clergy, the Ayatollahs themselves, who issue direct commands for the murder of their own populace, as well as members of parliament who have openly incited such killings, and many others. More could certainly be done. One should diplomatically strengthen the signal significantly by expelling their ambassador. Sadly, there's still a German hostage in Iran, at least one, a German with no Iranian ancestry, who was arrested. He had intended to create art projects, photograph the desert, and was then taken captive as a hostage. This means the Foreign Office states they must, in some manner, engage in discussions with them to also secure the release of the hostages. And by the way, hostage diplomacy is part of the regime's hybrid warfare as well. But that can also be done at a business level. You don't need an official diplomatic representation for that. The 4 banks could be closed. There are still Iranian airlines that are allowed to land in Europe. We should consider whether it would make sense to revoke their landing permits, and the IZH ban should be expanded. With the IZH ban, various associations in Germany were also banned. But there are others that have connections to the regime, like the Al-Mustafa Institutes, and they should actually be banned as well. And then, consideration would need to be given to broadening the Samidun ban to include all individuals who collaborate with them. Thus, the leading figures of Samidun are virtually identical to Massa Badil, and they remain active. So, the activity ban should be seriously implemented, and Massa Badil, along with all those affiliated with Massa Badil, should also be subject to prohibitions. And then, of course, comes enforcement. So, much like with the sanctions against Russia, these financial flows must be meticulously tracked. Assets must be definitively frozen, and all possible measures must be fully implemented. And here in Germany, we face a substantial problem because the implementation of these measures is delegated to the federal states. So, these aren't federal mandates, but rather implemented by individual state police forces. Especially concerning money laundering, certain German states assign responsibility to the Public Order Office, which, as you can imagine, is quite often overwhelmed. So we have a significant problem on an operational level. Even if the legal possibilities are now provided, they often aren't carried out because the know-how is simply lacking, the investigators are too thinly staffed, and sometimes the implementation falls to departments that are simply not qualified for it.
In the past, it's become repeatedly clear just how deeply connected Iran's proxies already are within Europe. That means Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas. To what extent does this EU ban affect them now, and potentially the funding that Iran will lose as a result?
Hamas received hundreds of millions of dollars every year. In the years before October 7th, there are estimates that they received 350 million per year from Iran, also in preparation for October 7th. Hezbollah, on the other hand, receives an estimated $50 to $100 million annually. So if that's gone, they will feel it. They also complain about it. So you see these waves of indignant interviews. Whenever Iran has less funding available, then there are interviews with Hamas leaders, for example, complaining that the funding has dried up. So it significantly weakens them. By the way, the regime had announced that in 2025 it would increase defense spending, and I use defense in quotes, as it's truly just about rebuilding the proxy army from 8 billion to 24 billion. Thus, halting this financing naturally ensures peace not only in the Middle East but also right here at home. This means the terrorist organizations will have a much harder time getting refinanced, because Iran, the regime, was their biggest backer. However, regarding the Houthis specifically, they primarily receive their supplies through smuggling activities. And arms smuggling is one of the biggest issues there, and it's mainly carried out by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. So in this specific case, it hits the Houthis hard as well. And the other key aspect is that Hezbollah and the Houthis are deeply engaged in a shadow economy, where funds are extensively laundered via maritime shipping, not merely smuggled, but genuinely. Certain financial networks are established where specific goods are moved back and forth between various companies, enabling them to effectively circumvent existing sanctions. This will at least make it more difficult. Of course, it also depends a bit on what can be investigated and which companies can be stopped. But there are definitely shipping businesses or maritime corporations, shipping companies operating in Europe. They will undoubtedly feel the impact of this. What definitely has not worked so far, at least, is stopping trade with China. China stands as the largest consumer of oil, and this is likely why representatives of the regime are scheduled to meet with US representatives in Istanbul this Friday. And cutting off this oil trade is actually one of the US president's goals, because it ultimately targets China. That was the point of the move in Venezuela, stopping the flow of Iranian oil. This in turn weakens China, and that appears to be one of the primary objectives for the US, to strategically weaken China by severing its vital oil supply. But for now, China remains the largest buyer of Iranian oil, and therefore one of the biggest sources of income for the regime in Iran.
It's not just countries that are hostile to Iran, there are also partners, of course. How should we assess the ongoing influence of countries like Russia or China, for example, in such a situation?
Well, China supplies Iran with surveillance technology and on a massive scale. There are collaborations between Russia and Iran. It's not just the Shahed drones used against Europeans in Ukraine that are a result of this cooperation. Incidentally, there were also Shahed drones that were deployed in Syria against the Syrian army currently in place. Well, there are definitely military collaborations. Also, there's cooperation concerning satellite surveillance between Russia, China and Iran, and of course significant economic cooperations. On the one hand, Russia could potentially step in to replace Iran's oil supply to China, but Russia is actively trying to avoid becoming entirely dependent on China. Conversely, China also doesn't want to become fully reliant on Russia. This means that if you disrupt this axis, you will most certainly weaken all three of them. And there is also cooperation in the area of terrorism to circumvent sanctions. In the realm of money laundering, Russian and Iranian entities have collaborated for an extended period. And indeed, the Iranians have actively assisted the Russian regime in circumventing sanctions. However, in the realm of organized crime, there are also links between the two countries, as they act as clients for gangs who then carry out these assignments, especially contract killings.
So, what are your current predictions regarding the immediate future of Iran at this moment? Can we even speak of predictions yet? Is the situation still too dynamic? Is there any way to say, it's likely to develop in this direction?
It's very, very difficult. There's shock paralysis right now. There's no one left on the streets, although I saw last night protests are flaring up again. It most certainly will not be the final protest. The waves of dissent will grow ever stronger, escalating the pressure on the regime. The population does not stand behind the regime in any way. There are different scenarios, and the difficult thing, it is very difficult. It's like looking into a crystal ball. So a great deal depends on the current talks with the regime. If the Trump administration gets involved and agrees to some kind of standstill agreement, meaning certain demands, such as the cessation of nuclear armament, would be met. And interestingly, at this very moment, they have two such demands in play. Thus, for Friday, their demands are that nuclear armament be halted and that all violence against the protesters cease. Previously, it also involved the regime's missile program, which naturally poses a significant threat to Israel, but furthermore, it includes missiles capable of striking Europe. And previously, there was the additional demand that they cease funding terrorist groups in the Middle East. Both were dropped. Why they are not mentioned or if they will return, I don't know. But those would, of course, be demands that the regime probably wouldn't meet. However, if the main objective is simply to cease the violence against protesters and temporarily halt nuclear armament, then they might enter into an agreement with the Trump administration essentially stating, we will just bide our time. We'll wait for the next 3 years and then we'll go back to doing whatever we want. That would be dangerous. That would give the regime crucial time to recover and to regroup effectively. Khamenei, the current supreme leader in Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, is 86 years old. He will certainly pass away within the next few years, but then the crucial question is who will seize power, and that person or organization, most likely the Revolutionary Guard Corps, who will nominate someone to leadership, will be exceptionally well organized. And if they get 3 years to regroup, the oppression will become even more brutal than it is now. Though hard to imagine, it's still possible. Nevertheless, the population won't want to keep living as they are. That means it will cost a lot of blood. And exactly how that will unfold, we shall see. The Iranians, of course, are still holding out hope for some form of intervention from the United States. At the moment, the Trump administration says they don't want to overthrow the regime. Last week, there were various statements on this, including from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. However, what we've seen so far is that Trump uses words as a strategy, not as something that is actually put into practice. So you never really know what happened next. They could be lulling people into a false sense of security, then attack. Should the regime attack Israel, which it has already announced it would do in the event of a US attack, they stated they would attack regionally, Israel will retaliate and seize the opportunity to completely destroy their missile program. That's something that wasn't accomplished in the 12-day war, but it will absolutely be carried out then. For the population, it's very hard to say. Everyone knows things can't go on. Everyone knows the next uprising is coming. The current regime will inevitably fall, and what transpires afterward remains entirely unknown. But worse, and this is something I always say in political consultations, it can hardly get any worse. The level of terrorist support we've witnessed, which directly impacts us, simply cannot be escalated any further. Therefore, the danger for us is not that the regime might collapse. The danger for us is that the regime stays in power.
Thank you very much, MS Schönenbach, for these well-founded insights. Your work can be read online. We'll be happy to link to it. You also write articles, consistently deep analyses, which are always very valuable. So it's always good for research purposes as well. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, activate the bell, share the conversation on social media, and you can find more analyses, background talks, and reports regularly at Mena-Watch. My name is Jasmin Arémi. See you at the next MENA Talk.
Vielen Dank für die Einladung.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.